Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I've got in front of me is listed officially on her product page as a half-orc blacksmith. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure how to categorize what this video actually is. It turned into more of an experiment and just having some fun painting than really a true guide. But despite that, what I think you'll find is something that's useful for maybe Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder. And as I mentioned in the video ahead, I had started out intending to use her as an enchanter for Frostgrave. So the miniature itself I think has got a bunch of uses, but the color choices and some of the techniques I'm going to show you might prove interesting. In particular, that great walloping arm was a lot of fun to paint and very simple. So as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, and I'll be sure to include a link to the My Mini Factory page where you can pick up the STLs for this cool little miniature. Anyhow, let's get started. So as always, the first thing to do once you've assembled your miniature, cleaned her up and cured her, is to go ahead and prime it. Now I've used here grey, the Rattlecan grey from Vallejo, but anything light-ish will work just fine here. Now painting a miniature when you don't have a painted example already to give you some ideas, it can be a little bit daunting because you're looking at a blank canvas. And as anyone who's ever written something or painted something can tell you, there is nothing more terrifying than that big blank sheet. So that's what I want to spend a little bit of time just at the start here concentrating on, where to find ideas and how a miniature can inform what we might do to paint it. So we've got a half-orc, and she's got a big mechanical arm. Clearly very strong, she looks capable. I'm going to use her as a wizard in my Frostgrave collection of all things, but concentrating on the miniature. So, big, strong, steampunk, that's where this starts getting me thinking. I'm probably going to want to use brass. Her skin naturally is going to be green, so thinking about complementary colors to paint her clothing, maybe some reds or some earthy tones. Now, thinking of other sources of inspiration, if we look, what are some cool okay, I'm going to name drop a couple of things, which if you know them, you're probably going to cheer. So I'm actually thinking of Long John Silver from Treasure Planet. You remember him? Big dude with the big mechanical arm, multi-purpose sort of style thing. That was really cool. And just her build and her face says to me Jaeger Monster from Girl Genius. Now, I know there weren't a huge number of Jaeger women, but we have the advantage we can print them whenever we want. So that's what I'm thinking. Beiges, reds, leather colors for her clothing, and we're going to lean into the Treasure Planet kind of Girl Genius look for the rest of her. I think, yeah, that'll look quite cool. So as always, we're going to start with the areas where we are most likely to make a mess and work our way up from there. So that means we're going to start with her arm. What I have is Balthasar Gold, which despite the name is really a nice brassy color. And it's just going to be perfect for that steampunk-inspired finish. You'll see it covers fairly well, but on bigger flat areas, like up on the shoulder joint here, I might want to come back and give it a second coat to make sure that there's no streaking of the brush strokes. But luckily we can be fairly rough with this. Just jam it in there and make sure that we're not missing anything. Now I did do a second coat over the big bobbly bit at the top there, but that's come out quite well. Now, because it is quite a large section of the miniature, this bright color is really going to dominate what we do. I'm going to balance it out with some other colors fairly similar to it. I'm going to talk about the magic triangle a little bit later on, but for now we need to carry on with some base coats. What I have here is German Field Grey for her skin, and this is a neat green-grey sort of color. It's going to be super dark going on, but of course we are going to layer it up and make it a bit lighter over time. So let's just coat her skin. Don't worry too much if you hit her clothing or what have you. The only thing you don't want to hit at this point is the bronze that you've just painted. I did come back and give her skin a second coat of that field grey. Goodness me, it's a bit like painting a green Catachan. What I'm going to do though, because she's got such an expressive sculpt, it would really be a shame not to paint in her eyes and teeth. So I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo Ivory and do this now because, check this out, if I make a big mess, which I'm probably going to because this is much harder with the camera in the way. Yeah, there we go, blorp. But if I cover in her eyes with a few quick strokes of ivory, Same with her teeth and a little smile. Once we've made a good mess of her face, grab a little bit of black. I'm using here Black Templar Contrast because it will flow very nicely. What I'll do then is paint a vertical line very carefully into her eye like this. Hello! Then we can go back with our base color for the skin, so back to my field gray in this case, and start tidying up. So we're going to tidy up her lips, around her cheeks where her little tusks are, and around her eyes so she doesn't have the big goggle look going. Now I've done that a few times, but no matter how often I do it, it still gives me the willies. I'm never sure it's going to look quite right, and then it does. Hooray! So we'll move on now and start painting in the rest of her details, and luckily it doesn't matter too much in what order we do these. This is all going to be fairly simple, so I will speed through this stage a little more quickly. What I have here, this is US Field Drab from Vallejo. It's very similar to Steel Legion Drab from the Citadel line, if that's something that you're using, but it is a little bit lighter. So you see, still thinking of like artificers and blacksmiths and stuff like that. I want to stick to a nice earthy palette, which will also help the green and the bronze really stand out. So away we go with the trousers. You'll see I've gone straight over the top of any straps or equipment pouches on them. I'm going to paint those another color later, so it doesn't matter too much. I don't need to avoid them. I've got here Morghast Bone, and I'm going to paint in the next largest area of color, which will be her shirt, or I don't know what this would be, her top anyway. So this will cover fairly well for such a light color, but you'll see we are getting a little bit of the primer still showing through. So once I've applied this first coat, I'll let this dry thoroughly, and then give it a second. Now, full disclosure, that did take 3 coats, and across her back it took 4 to get a nice solid color, but it is important. What I'll do now is paint in some of the leather details. What I'm using here is Mournfang Brown. This is because it's a nice, warm, very faintly reddish sort of tone. So what I'm doing here, I'll start with the wraps around her wrist. By introducing a bit of red in this direction, we're starting that magic triangle. The eye is going to be drawn from the arm to her wrist, and then wherever else we put this brown. So I am going to paint in her belt with it, and this equipment stuff, and these straps around her legs, and these little pouches. Now that will cover quite well, but especially on her belt, you might need to come back and touch up the little pouches. I have here Evil Sun Scarlet, and this is quite bright, but it's going to cover over our grey primer fairly well. I'm going to paint in her hairband with this. And why we've used such a strong red tone on the top of her head is because for her boots, I'm going to use something fairly similar. This is Cavalry Brown, and you'll see it's a very strong red leather color. From the Citadel range, something like Doomball Brown is fairly close to this. But of course, you can do these boots any color you like. I really like red leather. Like I said, isn't that a nice red leather color? Anyhow, we're going to paint in her hair now, and for this I've got German Grey. This is a dark, very dark blue-black color from Vallejo. You could use here Corvus Black from Citadel, or even just a regular black if that's what you want to use. Now at last we can tackle her hammer. For this I'm going to use Lead Belcher, although any metallic you like will work just fine here. I wanted to start from quite a dark base coat because I wanted to be able to do more with it once it's shaded. So I'm going to go all over the hammer, and then parts that I want to tidy up later, we'll carry on painting those. Now there isn't really very much left to do. What I have here is Retributor Armor, and I'm going to paint this in on the little icon she's wearing on her chest. I guess it's just a clasp or something really for holding her thing together. And as well, her little belt buckle, I'm going to do this in a gold color too. And you might notice that once again, we've created another triangle on the miniature. And yeah, look up the magic triangle, and not just from me, but from other sources too. It's a really interesting way to decide where to put colors on a miniature. And now the final base color we're going to apply is to pick something to go on the haft of a hammer here. I've got Screamer Pink because it's a nice deep purpley sort of color, And it looks good once it's shaded. I think it's a pretty funky little color for like leather wraps and stuff like that, where you want a bit of color. You could go for a light green or something if you want to go for a slightly shocking tone up here to add a little bit of visual interest. Now at this point, any last minute tidy up that you need to do, you can cruise around and fix up your base coats. What we're going to do now is to shade her. Now you could use neat Agrax Earthshade, but what I've got here, this is a little bottle that I've mixed half and half Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian Medium. The importance of the medium is really that it's going to thin the shading effect a little and it won't make flatter areas quite so dark. But what we'll do, load my brush up and start applying this over the entire miniature. Make sure that you really do get it into any recesses, but particularly on her face, try and steer it away from her eyes a little. Otherwise, just go nuts, cover the whole model, and we'll come back about half an hour later once this is dried. We've got a lot of depth and some wonderful shading, but we have made some of her quite dark, in particular her skin. Now since that is such a prominent part of the miniature, we're going to go back to the field grey, and I'm going to paint over most of the skin, leaving just the darker areas in the recesses with that shaded stuff. You'll see it doesn't make a huge difference, but for the purposes of how we're going to highlight her skin, it will be quite important that we don't skip this stage. So, covering over most of it again with field grey. Now after having done that, what I've mixed up is the highlight colour for her skin. This is roughly 2 parts field grey with 1 part Vallejo Khaki. You could use something like green grey or similar here instead, but Khaki has a little bit of a yellowish warmth to it, which I think makes for a slightly better skin tone. What we'll do is just the same as if we were highlighting those catachans. Let's go ahead and start adding a little bit of this over raised areas of musculature. And there's a lot of this on Dear Rosie here, so take your time. If you do need any pointers on how to go for it, then in all seriousness, go check out a catachan guide. Look at how those big burly arms are painted. It's going to put you in good stead here, but because the sculpting is so pronounced, you'll find it's probably not too difficult to see where you ought to be highlighting with this slightly richer skin tone. I'll come back in a few minutes once I've done this and see what we've got. And then unfortunately, I can't really give you much guidance beyond add a little bit more khaki to your mix. And now we're going to start highlighting it the same as we would sort of traditional skin. So looking at the backs of knuckles, making those a little bit more pronounced. Same to some of the edges of her muscles. And up on her face, things like her chin and her brow. Now we're going to start highlighting these. And then as a very final highlight, same as if we were using Flayed One Flesh or something, what I have here is some neat khaki. And what we'll do is starting with her knuckles, dip those in. And on areas like her face, let's just do the tip of her nose, the edges of her brows, chin, and what have you. And there we go. See what I mean about using khaki rather than green-grey? I think the less chalky, sort of grey ashen finish looks a little nicer. What I'm going to use now, let's put her down for a second, is just a tiny bit of Necron Compound. And I'm using one of my little dry brushes from the stationery aisle. A little cheap, small brush that won't hold very much paint. What I'll do is very lightly, that might be a little bit much actually, just start flicking along some of the edges of the brass. There we go. We want a little bit of difference in color here, and a very careful dry brush is a great way to pick that out. Take your time as you come around the front. You don't need to overdo this. And part of the reason why we're using such a small brush is we'll still be able to lightly flick at the shoulder and hopefully avoid her face. Now that's nice and quick and super easy. Just take your time and make sure you haven't got much on your brush. What I've got here, this is Coelia Green Shade, and it's a color I don't really get to use very often, but I'm always glad to have it when I do. What I'm going to do is put just a tiny bit of this onto some of the areas where you'd see like grease and oil start to build up. So concentrate around joints. And if you do put on a little bit too much, just wipe some of it off with your finger. It'll look quite natural. So joints, actuators, and a few little bits. Now in the end, I actually applied a lot more of that than I thought I would, and end result I actually quite like. So the apply and then dab away effect works really well, something to bear in mind with grimy old bronze stuff. What I have, we're going back to Morghast Bone, and we're going to do the same with her top as we did her skin, and that is to highlight, or rather to base coat, most of it again and leave just the shaded stuff in the recesses. Really, we want to tidy this up a little bit before we get to highlighting. Now that's going to be finicky, and I'd recommend thin your paint down just a little bit more than you might normally so that it flows smoothly. You want it to settle and have a nice smooth finish. I'm going to now highlight that area, and I have here Screaming Skull. It's going to look super sharp going on, but it will tone down a little as it dries. And we do want quite a bit of contrast with these highlights. With this, you can do as much or as little of it as you like. I think it's just good to help define some of the edges and make some of these creases and folds just a little bit more prominent. Looking good. What we'll do now is highlight some of the curls in her hair with a little bit of Dawnstone. If you want to stick to Vallejo, you could also use here London Grey. That's quite a good substitute. You don't have to do very much of this, just enough that it catches some of the edges of these little curls. Then with just a tiny wee bit of Wild Rider Red, I'm going to do the same thing to her bow. Bows. We'll use just a few little patches of Deathclaw Brown to highlight the Mournfang Brown we did earlier. If you want to, you can also stick to Scrag Brown instead. That will give you a slightly darker edge to these details. We'll then go back to Retributor Armor to brighten up a couple of those gold details. And then we'll use a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of Stormhost Silver just to ding the edges. And really, you see how little there is on the brush? That's important. And then the last thing we'll do is to highlight her trousers. What I've got, this is half and half US Field Drab, which we used for the base of her trousers, and a little bit of Ivory, which we used for her eyes and teeth. Mix it about half and half, and she'll be golden. Once this is done, what I'm going to do is take her outside, hit her with a matte varnish, and then I'm going to pop a base on. Because she's going to be for my Frostgrave stuff, I am going to base her with a snowy sort of finish. And yeah, let's get a look at what she looks like when she's all finished. So there at last, our half-orc blacksmith is complete. Now, I really had a lot of fun painting her. I think you can probably tell. Particularly with the skin and such, I don't ordinarily go that far in my painting, but I thought maybe showing you a couple of the steps there might prove interesting. And in particular, I hope you find the skin recipe useful for whatever project you might have in mind, whether you're painting half-orcs or anybody with green skin. In particular, do try out the greyish tint that I suggest during the video as well. You might find that useful, no matter what it is that you end up using it for. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Rod, Andrew, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep buying resin for these things, folks. Any questions or anything, as always, feel free to drop them in the comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.